Today I'm very happy to introduce Anna Stirr, whose topic is Gokul Joshi and revolutionary asceticism among Nepali people's singer. So Anna's research focuses on South Asia, particularly on Nepal and Himalayan regions. She's widely published, including a monograph called Singing Across Divides, Music and Intimate Politics in Nepal in 2017, and numerous chapters and journal articles. Her current work is on two projects that deal with love, intimacy, and politics in Nepal. The first looks at impoverished Dohori question-answer songs as culturally intimate gendered expressions of ideas of nation and heritage within a cycle of migration and media circulation that spans the globe. The second chronicles the history of Nepal's politically oppositional progressive songs from the 1960s to the present, with a focus on ideas of love, development, and communist thought as interrelated ways for imagining a better future. So Anna is also active as a performer. After a bachelor's degree in Western classical flute performance, she studied Hindustani classical flute. And as a singer, she's also studied the Hindustani classical tradition with a number of teachers and ustads, and has also learned Nepali folk and Dohori song as she learned the flute styles in the informal oral tradition. She's currently a professor of Asian studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and has woken up very early to join us. So thank you, Anna, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Iftikhar. So today I'm going to be talking about Gokul Joshi and the idea of revolutionary asceticism among Nepali people's singers. In the spring of 2019, I sat talking with the Nepali Maoist singer-songwriter Karna Gautam Pariyar, also known by his stage name Bidroi. We were discussing a recent concert, that's what this picture is of, celebrating the career of the progressive singer J.B. Ture. Politically, 2017 to 2021 had been a time of communist unity, and the cultural groups of multiple communist parties had been performing together in the same concerts. The short-lived UML and Maoist Center merger had also merged their cultural groups, and in concerts they were also often bringing in performers from other communist parties. In this showcase concerts, UML and Maoist artists performed together on stage, backing J.B. Ture in performances of all his best-known songs. Their party's unity in their artistic collaboration was fraught with tension and would indeed end in a few years, but they were able to unite to honor J.B. and his legacy. "This is how I want to be known," said Bidroi. "I'm not going to sing other kinds of songs. I'm going to dedicate my life to progressive song only. No matter what genre I compose in, I'll make the songs progressive, and I won't deviate from this line. There are only a few who have been able to do this their whole lives: Ryan, Ramesh, J.B. Ture, Khusiram Pakrin, Jivan Sharma, and Gokul Joshi before them." With this list of men, Bidroi articulated his view of a lineage of true progressive singers. True progressive singers were those who remained true to their bichar, their ideology or political moral ideals, despite the personal costs of doing so, who sang only songs with progressive messages, and who never sold out. Why are these people the exemplars of the true progressive singer for the progressive singers of today? This talk begins to explore this question with a focus on Gokul Joshi, who is often referred to as first in a lineage of progressive artists. There are competitors for that title, but the reasoning goes that Gokul Joshi's embrace of a peripatetic lifestyle puts him into a separate category, beyond his more sedentary contemporaries like Kevalpuri Kisan, who also wrote and sang progressive songs in the 1950s. Although I've just started looking more deeply into the life of Gokul Joshi, I've been researching Nepali music and poetry for 22 years, and over the past decade, my focus has turned significantly to the history of song in Nepal's communist movements. So what I have for you today is emerging research backed with extensive ethnographic experience as a scholar and performer within Nepal's folk, pop, classical, and adhunik music scenes, especially the traditional and commercial sides of the popular folk music known as Lokdori and the music and dance of the political left. My work is both ethnographic and historical, and my sources include the personal archives, publications, and recordings and oral history interviews with many of the major players in the progressive song or people's song movement who are still living today. My personal life brought me into close touch with grassroots and leading artists of the political party called Masal and the UML, as well as their political leaders since the early 2000s. Since the end of the People's War in 2006, I've also come to know many artists and leaders associated with the erstwhile CPN Maoist and its splinter parties. During 2018 and 2019, I did extensive fieldwork with artists from all these parties, and I'll be returning to do more in just 3 short weeks. My sources about Gokul Joshi right now are pretty slim. They include a biography by Kim Parishrami, 2 poems printed within, some songs of his recorded by next generation progressive singer Ramesh Shrestha, and my interviews with those who knew him and those who look up to him. So we are looking at Gokul Joshi the myth as much as Gokul Joshi the man. I should start with some background regarding what happened before Gokul Joshi came on to Nepal's literary and musical scene. Nepal's progressive song or people's song movement is said to have emerged as a distinct genre in contrast to general protest songs around the time of the movement against the Ranas that started in the late 1930s. Predecessors to Gokul Joshi come mostly from the Kathmandu elite, people like Laxmiprasad Devkota and others who wrote against the injustices of the time and staged dramas that included sung sections. Another strand of predecessors comes from the Nepali Congress-led anti-Rana movement based in Biratnagar. Members of the Koirala family started Nepal Democracy Radio, which had musical programs with militant songs against the Ranas. While I've not yet been able to trace the exact history of their connections, based on shared melodies and lyrical imagery, it is extremely likely that the songwriters in this movement, including Tarini-Prasad Koirala, other Koirala brothers, and their relative Ranu Devi Adhikari, had heard the songs and seen the musical plays of the Bengali, Bihari, and maybe even Assamese cultural troupes affiliated with the Indian People's Theatre Association, or IPTA. Finally, another earlier predecessor in the 1940s is the female ascetic Yogmaya Neopani of Bhojpur, a Brahmin widow who was far ahead of her time, defied all conventions, and wrote highly literary anti-caste and anti-patriarchy songs in the folk sloka tradition. Choosing Hinduism rather than the nascent world of party politics as the milieu for her social protests against Brahminical patriarchy, she and her hundreds of followers were seen as a major threat to the Rana government. Her songs and poems, known as Hazrubani, have been kept alive by her followers to this day. As a woman and a recognized threat to the social and political order, Yogmaya's place in the public record of history was suppressed until her rediscovery by the progressive writer Parizat and the Arab-American anthropologist Barbara Nimri Aziz in the 1970s. It was Parizat and other members of her artistic collective Ralpha that in its heyday from 1966 to 1973 would raise up Gokul Joshi and Yogmaya as 2 very different icons of political protest music in Nepal. For reasons we can address later, but which come down to, I think, patriarchy and a preference among communists for expressions of a more secular nature, Gokul Joshi became the model for progressive singers, while Yogmaya has much more slowly become a broader cultural icon and is currently receiving more academic and popular cultural attention than Gokul. So let's look at Gokul and what's known about him and see how he fits into ideals of revolutionary asceticism from his own time up until the present day. According to people's singers of today, Gokul's life has set the pattern for being a true progressive singer in Nepal. His biographer Kim Parishrami describes him as engaging in a constant struggle on behalf of the oppressed with a proletarian worldview and always at the expense of his own comfort and health. The story of his life and his rejection of party affiliations also makes it apparent that his commitments were first to poetry and the people, rather than to any political party. His wandering life had an obvious model in the Hindu ascetic, the sadhu or jogi, later joined with the rhetoric of communism's new man, which has received extensive consideration in the literature on communism from before the Russian Revolution, through its application in Mao's China, Che's Cuba, and Nepal's Maoist movement as well. This model continued to inspire aspiring progressive singers of subsequent generations. The communist new man should have selfless dedication to the collective and value austerity and discipline. In China, the ideal of the new man was propagated through stories of real people whose deeds seemed to have elevated them to the status of an ideal communist. These stories made their way to Nepal from the 1960s in Peking Review and China Pictorial, in rarer phonograph records, and in other media from the 1980s on. In Cuba and beyond, it was Che Guevara himself who got held up as the exemplary new man, and this legacy is perhaps the most visible in Nepal today. It is Che the legend, rather than Guevara's revolutionary strategy, that has been most influential in Nepal. The influence of new man ideology on communist thought among youth and artists in Nepal has been discussed by ethnographers like Marie Lecomte-Lewin, Anne Dessalles, Ina Zarkovich, and Monica Moten. They have paid close attention to its use in the Maoist movement, and especially on how young Maoist cadres and cultural workers valued discipline and embraced austerity. Marie Lecomte-Lewin's work looks closely at interfaces with Hinduism and ideologies relevant to kingship and war. In a recent article of my own, I try to swing the other way and look at the direct historical influence of Chinese ideologies on pre-Maoist groups, especially Mosal's cultural group Rakbin Parivar since the 1980s. Today, though, we rarely hear the terms Naya Manche or Rato Manche anymore, like we used to during the People's War years. But Liu Shaoqi's pamphlet, How to Be a Good Communist, circulates in Nepali translation on communist-affiliated websites and in bookstores. In the literature of the Nepal Workers' and Peasants' Party, it's been very easy to find ever since the 1960s. Currently, the institutions emphasizing self-transformation and austere discipline to become a good communist are less powerful and all-encompassing in Nepal than they once were. But at least in the progressive song field, the importance of exemplary stories remains. Gokul Joshi's is one such story that both fits and doesn't fit with the ideals of revolutionary asceticism that developed as communist parties developed in Nepal. He also allows me to make connections with some aspects of Hindu and Buddhist culture that have bearing on how ascetics can be idealized. So here I focus on Gokul Joshi, how he's been represented, and how artists to the present day refer to him as an influence and a predecessor. So I'll begin with Gokul Joshi, then discuss Ralpha, and then end with J.B. Ture again. The following account of Gokul Joshi's life is based on Kim Parishrami's short biography of people's poet Gokul Joshi. I have the second edition, which was published in 1999. This edition does not indicate the first edition's date of publication, but since the writer Parijat wrote the foreword and the latest date referred to in the work is 1983, we can guess that it was published maybe sometime around 1984 and definitely before Parijat's death in 1993. The man who would come to be known as Gokul Joshi was born Gokulprasad Pohural in Raipur, Tanung in 1930. His farming family had little land, and with his 5 siblings, Gokul worked as a day laborer in the fields of others. In 1944, at the age of 13 or 14, he followed his older brother to India to find work. His younger brother soon followed, and his sisters married and left home. Left alone, his mother sold the farm and moved in with relatives. Gokul traveled all over India, working in a medicine shop in Shillong with his older brother, then enlisting in the Indian Army. The army took him to Madras, where he received some formal education, but also got in trouble for insubordination. Court-martialed and discharged, he went to Bombay and worked in a restaurant, then as a cleaner and painter of ships. Along the way, he went to night school and passed 4th grade. His career in the shipyards ended when he was fired for organizing a strike. Having seen a bit of the world and learned how to be a labor organizer, he returned to Nepal after the success of the anti-Rana movement in 1951, hoping that the success of the anti-Rana democracy movement might have made things better there. Contrary to his hopes, on return to Nepal, Gokul discovered that, I quote, change had only come for cunning individuals. Right upon his return, he met Tankoprasad Acharya and Brahmhari Sharma, leaders of the Praja Parisad, who were impressed by his singing and gave him a job working for the party in the Eastern Terai. He was fired a few months later for supporting a strike among laborers at Kathmandu's new Gaucharan airport. Giving up his membership in the Praja Parisad, he returned to Kathmandu and busked in the city's alleyways, which is where he met fellow folk singer Dharmaraj Tapa in 1952. Dharmaraj Tapa was the son of a landed family who busked on the streets out of his own interest rather than out of necessity, and also moved in the circles of the urban elite. For the next few years, he and Gokul Joshi would work together in an uneasy partnership strained by their very different class backgrounds. Dharmaraj invited Gokul to live with him, and introduced him to his circle of urban progressive intellectuals, including Laxmiprasad Devkota. But Gokul was distrustful of these bourgeois intellectuals' level of commitment to working on behalf of the oppressed. Nevertheless, when Tapa was imprisoned under accusations of having sung in support of K.I. Singh's 1952 Rakshadal revolt, Joshi led protests against his imprisonment and rallies around the city. Once Dharmaraj was released, the two traveled around Nepal and northern India together, performing and raising money for the literary magazine Damfechari. They went east to Calcutta, then west to Dehradun, where they met the celebrated travel writer and leftist intellectual Rao Sanskrityayan. During these travels, Gokul was evidently inspired by the former extent of the Gorkha Empire. On the way back to Nepal in Bhaksu, they were arrested because of Gokul's truthful answer to the police who questioned them. Gokul said, "We are traveling to learn about people's suffering and work for their liberation." Dharmaraj posted their bail, which only exacerbated the tension between them. After a final interpersonally fraught performing journey to Teratum, their partnership dissolved. Gokul Joshi became a member of the Communist Party in 1954. At that time, there was only one Communist Party in Nepal still, and he was sent to campaign through songs and poetry in the Terai. But he withdrew his membership in the following year, intending to travel around and perform by himself. He chose schools and local outdoor gathering places like chautaras and parks for his performances. When K.I. Singh returned from exile in China in 1955, Gokul returned to Kathmandu to join the welcoming committee. He sang his songs and recited poems at informal welcome gatherings, such as in the famous poet's haunt of Bhugal Park in New Road. At a formal welcome gathering, K.I. Singh awarded him a prize of 300 rupees for the poem he recited, but no copies of this poem appear to have survived. After this, Joshi attended the 1955 Asian Solidarity Conference in Delhi. In 1957, he settled in Tapa and taught at a school in the village of Kailadubba. Despite having renounced his party membership, he campaigned for the Nepal Communist Party in the 1959 elections. The following year, he contracted tuberculosis. Gokul Joshi died in his adopted home of Tapa on June 18, 1961, at the age of 31, and his students and fellow teachers from Kailadubba School performed his last rites. So let's look at some perspectives on Gokul Joshi that have added to this myth of his life. So Kem Parishrami writes about him that he wrote many poems in the Jaure meter. The Jaure meter is associated with rurality, and it's also seen as sort of low in the literary world. And this was especially true in Gokul Joshi's day. So Parishrami writes, in his time, Jaure was viewed with a disparaging eye. So those who were considered the top literary figures in Kathmandu saw his poems as simply political propaganda. They saw him as a Gaini poet, a wanderer, a beggar. But even so, he went around singing of the people's problems in the people's own language and earned a place in the people's hearts. So these epithets the elites bestowed upon him equated him with the rural, the vulgar, and the Dalit, and this way allowed them to dismiss his critiques. But his supporters praised his travels as having given him the experiential basis for expressing the reality of ordinary people's condition in his poems. The critic Govinda Bhatta wrote, "There was no unnecessary intellectual hypocrisy, nor any romantic notions of revolution in Gokul Prasad Joshi. The basis for his poems was the injustice, oppression, and exploitation in Nepali society that he himself had suffered, and the revolutionary worldview that he had developed through his own experiences and behavior. Instead of getting involved in unnecessary intellectual chatter and calling himself a revolutionary, he wandered from village to village, putting his own intellect and creations to use for the people's liberation, demonstrating his character with his actions more than his words." So, Gokul Joshi is someone from these perspectives who has totally dedicated himself to the cause of fighting injustice and oppression, and who chose to endure the hardships of a life on the road to work toward liberation for all. This idea of sacrifice is one of the cores of revolutionary asceticism. As a Brahmin individual who chose poverty and the life of the road to pursue his ideals, his life had many parallels with Hindu ideals of renunciation. Anthropologist Marie Lecomte-Lewin notes in a 2006 article that Parishrami's account of Gokul Joshi's life portrays him in terms reminiscent of a Hindu ascetic. Her article is about how Nepal's Maoist party reconfigured Hindu imagery, especially regarding martyrdom and sacrifice in battle. Though I lack the extensive evidence on which she based her analysis of Maoist poems of the People of War era, I think we can begin to make an argument about the connection of the charismatic poet, singer, songwriter with the figure not just of the general wandering sadhu, but the more specific one of the tantric yogi, with an emphasis on siddhas or magical powers. Parishrami indeed often refers to Gokul Joshi's rags and tatters, his dependence on others for survival, and his inability to stay in one place. All characteristics of a Hindu renunciant, beyond which the most important one is that Joshi is doing this all, of course, for the liberation of the proletarian classes from domination, rather than his own personal liberation in a Hindu soteriological framework. So these descriptions of mentioning his rags and tatters, his penchant for wandering and sleeping outside, his sometime drug use, and his rejection of the householder life recall these popular perceptions of sadhus across the Hindu world. In Nepal, these wandering ascetics are more often known by the term yogi, and this is the term Parishrami uses. The connotation is just slightly different. Yogi is associated with siddhas, or magical powers, and often with transgression of mainstream social norms to a greater extent than the generalized conception of a sadhu. Both Hinduism and Buddhism in Nepal are strongly tantric. Yogis in Nepal are seen as tantric siddhas in the lineage of great medieval tantric yogis like Goraknath and Matendranath, or their Buddhist counterparts like Milarepa. Masters of self-discipline or tapasya, they gave them not simply the spiritual insights or physical capabilities that the term is associated with in globalized Hinduism today, but these siddhis are magical powers. The Buddhist ones of the Kagyu tradition developed the concept of crazy wisdom, ways of demonstrating a truer understanding of the world through behavior that would appear crazy under dominant social norms. Gokul Joshi once referred to his own desire to become a sadhu and do tapasya, and confused the communist audience with this religious or superstitious language. They rationalized it, the story goes, in terms of Joshi's strong affection for his mother. But other stories that Parishrami records about Joshi suggest that Joshi was engaging poetically with the resonance of such religious concepts, performing the role of a new kind of yogi with crazy poetic wisdom in response to those who denigrated his chosen way of life and his efforts, or tried to bind him too closely with their own versions of mid-20th century revolutionary asceticism. For example, here's a story Parishrami tells. Balkrishna Pokhrel found Gokul near Pashupatinath temple, looking up and staring at the sun. He stood there for about 1 hour, and when he came out of his reverie, Pokhrel called him loudly, asking, "What is this that you're doing?" When asked, he blurted out, "I am a poet, I am an artist. Don't think of me as someone who tutors for a living. I will do no work besides writing poetry, and let the people take care of me or let me die." And even though Pokhrel forced him to come home with him and confined him inside a room to be treated for mental illness, he escaped through the window with a rope and ran away. So the figure of the artist as yogi, someone possessing near supernatural connections with the world beyond the human, and a concomitant humanistic talent for distilling the troubles of the Nepali people into song that was capable of touching even the hardest hearts. This is something that has lasted. Medieval yogis instrumentalized their spiritual siddhis to influence temporal power. Likewise, a belief in the power of words and music to affect the emotions and to cause political change remains strong, especially among those who aspire to be people's singers themselves. Perhaps the appeal of Gokul Joshi is that he stands an example of the power of song. So Parishrami describes conflict between Gokul Joshi and Dharmaraj Tapa in a way that paints Dharmaraj Tapa as a sellout and Gokul Joshi as a man who is true to his ideals. So Dharmaraj Tapa comes off as a feudal opportunist who was always acting superior, which prevented him from acting in the people's best interest. Dharmaraj Tapa, in contrast to Gokul Joshi, is remembered for having collected folk songs from all over Nepal, recording them at Radio Nepal, helping shape a national imaginary through curating the representation of Lokgit as Nepali national folk song, and writing textbooks, memoirs, and travelogues that continue to shape popular definitions of Nepali folk song. He lived a long and comfortable life, working first within the panchayat system and then the parliamentary democracy that followed it. He died in 2014 at the age of 90, with many national honors to his name. Because of this, it's Dharmaraj Tapa's recordings and prestige that remain, while over half of Gokul Joshi's written work has reportedly been lost, and there are no extant recordings of his performances. While researching for Joshi's biography in the 80s, Parishrami found that Dharmaraj Tapa was said to be in possession of many of Gokul Joshi's things, but was unwilling to let others see them. If any subsequent researchers have tried again, I am so far unaware of what came of their efforts. Now we've learned some about Gokul Joshi's life, so let's turn to what happened afterwards. The decade of the 1960s is generally considered a desert for progressive song, as the new panchayat regime went about squashing dissent with renewed vigor in the years after Joshi died. But things took a new turn later in this decade. Mentioning Gokul Joshi as an iconic leftist folk singer of the 1950s, the ethnomusicologist Ingmar Grandin asserts in a 2017 article, it was the new generation of political singers of the late 1960s who gave full momentum to the singing of progressive songs tailored to raise people consciousness. This new generation was epitomized by the group Ralpha, which formed in 1966. The young poets and folk singer-songwriters Manjul, Ryan, Ramesh, and Arim, and also Niran, who's pictured on the far left here, and many more people, were originally, well, these guys, the first four that I said, were originally employed as artists at Radio Nepal. And the writer Parijat, who's here on the far right-hand side, took notice of them and invited them to her salon in her house. With her encouragement, they began performing their own songs, written to raise consciousness about injustice and what could be done about it. They traveled throughout Nepal's eastern hills singing their songs, consciously trying to emulate Gokul Joshi. They knew of Gokul Joshi at least because Ramesh had seen him perform live in his youth, but it is also likely that Joshi's books were available and that members of Kathmandu's left-leaning literary scene may have had personal memories of him at the time. Ralpha was initially unaffiliated with any political party, same as Gokul Joshi for the most part, and explored different philosophical angles in their literary and musical works. In an interview with me in 2012, Ramesh said of Parijat's house, now really high-level writers would come there, like Bhupi Sherchan and all. So because of that, Parijat had created like a platform. There, they routinely had high-level discussions about politics, literature, music, philosophy, and about the writers who were the most popular all over the world. Camus, Sartre, and who was it? Solzhenitsyn, Russia's Solzhenitsyn, Allen Ginsberg, and other major people like Che Guevara, and all of these high-level philosophies, situationism, humanism. There are many like this, you know. So while all these discussions were going on about these subjects, I sat there and listened to these intellectuals a lot, and I got a lot of information about many things. It was like a class for me. Communism was part of what they discussed, but it wasn't the only thing. They wrote songs inspired by surrealism and initially tried to sound important by using difficult high-level linguistic forms, but they eventually decided to focus on writing folk songs to raise people's consciousness. As this project developed, they read more and more communist literature and turned towards different streams of communist thought themselves. It would be differences of opinion about armed struggle that would eventually break up Ralpha in 1973. But in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the folk musicians of Ralpha traveled together all over Nepal's eastern hills, finding great affection from the people and persecution and arrest from the police, and consciously thinking of themselves as following in Gokul Joshi's footsteps. Their admiration for him shines through in their writing. In the Ralpha memoir, The Footsteps of Memory, published first in 1988, compiler Manjul recounts Ramesh's story of meeting Gokul Joshi in Therathum. After we got to the Chautara below the goods office, Ramesh gestured over to a peepal tree and said, around 1959, Gokul Joshi came to Therathum. He sat below the trail near that peepal tree singing songs and selling books. How lucky Ramesh was. He had seen Gokul Joshi. He had heard Gokul Joshi singing songs. Dear readers, Just being able to see and meet good people is a thing to be proud of, right? This particular memoir contains a lot of moralizing. Manjul, or whoever's voice is being incorporated into the composite narrator's voice here, talks a lot about what they believe makes a person a good person. And much of this comes out in what sounds today like an overtly Brahminical, patriarchal, moralistic tone. Alcohol, drugs, and premarital flirtation, let alone sex, get excoriated, alternating with paragraphs expressing hatred for the oppressor classes. Musical judgments are also made. Businessmen's classical bhajan groups sound terrible and are blamed for keeping people awake at night. And the flirtatious improvised genres of Dori and the Limbu Palam are disgusting. On the other hand, solo folk songs that address the plight of the poor are praised, reproduced, and adopted into their repertoire. This contempt for love songs and songs perceived as vulgar continues to this day in the field of progressive songs. While it has, of course, been influenced by the worldwide communist perspective on love songs as bourgeois and escapist, and the need for more revolutionary songs to raise consciousness, the disdain for so-called vulgarity in the field of progressive song to this day carries strong elements of Brahminical patriarchy. Likewise, Ralpha's accounts of their journeys and the hardships they endured, which shaped their growing proletarian consciousness, recall both New Man and Hindu ascetic discourses of embodied cultivation of the self. How to become a better person, how to help others become better, and how to build a better society together was a central preoccupation of Ralpha's. These discourses and embodied practices remained even after Ralpha split, as the progressive song field became further institutionalized and entwined with political parties. Ralpha broke fewer social norms than Gokul Joshi did, and perhaps contributed to solidifying local dominant cultural norms in their interpretation of global communist moral ideology. But if their own accounts of their performances are to be believed, they were still sometimes received within the crazy wisdom vein by audiences who had no idea what to make of them. And they succeeded incredibly well in reproducing the model of the traveling consciousness-raising political singer-songwriter as an option for political activism in 1970s Nepal. They gained more affiliates, including J.B. Ture, whose concert I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. Already involved in the interests of the people, J.B. Ture began to spend time with Ralpha in Eastern Nepal. So zooming out for a minute also, Ralpha's success was also part of a global wave of what in the Soviet Union was called guitar poetry, the singer-songwriter-centric sing-along folk-based music that circulated worldwide with vague to strong leftist associations in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. With these local and global models to build on, the groundwork was laid for new cultural groups to form. These new groups did not embrace non-alignment like Ralpha and Gokul Joshi had, but for the most part affiliated with specific political parties. In 1978, the autocratic Panchayat regime held a referendum about its continued existence as such. Although they suspected it would be rigged, and it was, the political parties that had been in hiding for the past 2 decades chose this moment to increase their visible political activities, and many new musicians joined left politics as progressive singers. Political parties formed cultural fronts and held concerts amid the very real threat of police violence. By this time, there were many more political parties. Ramesh and Manjul had affiliated with one communist party and Parijat and Ryan with another. But in the mid-1980s, Ramesh and Manjul were kicked out, Gokul Joshi style, due to insubordination. Referring again to Gokul Joshi, Ramesh decided to remain independent for the rest of his life, thereby retaining the moral high ground. Ramesh is thus often held up as a true successor to Gokul Joshi, someone who couldn't be used in political machinations, someone who never sold out. But others saw things differently and put more importance in party affiliation and the importance of being part of a group in order to achieve the things that Gokul Joshi and their other predecessors had begun singing about. So J.B. Ture, he's in the center here, remained affiliated with the Marxist-Leninist Party, which later became the United Marxist-Leninist Party, and he was involved in the leadership of its national cultural organization for decades after it was formed at the time of the referendum. He joined the Maoist Party only in 2012 once he became disillusioned with the UML. The third generation of people that Vidroi described to me on that day as true people's singers included 2 younger men who joined politics around the time of the referendum, Khudiram Pakrin and Jivan Sharma. So Khudiram Pakrin is here on the left and Jivan Sharma is standing there next to Devi Turi on the right. So what did these politically affiliated artists and the organizations they represented have in common with Gokul Joshi? They tell me that their goals were always people's liberation. They too traveled around, now with troops of performers, singing songs and performing plays and dances to raise people's consciousness. They saw themselves as Gokul Joshi's successors. J.B. Thure told me in 2012, we were making people aware of the monarchy. We were singing songs to raise consciousness and send those messages. We did the work of bringing the people closer. We cultural workers. The party was underground. He described how he stayed in the party when Ramesh and Manjul were ejected, and then jumped from the 1980s to the present day to say, now, later, I'm continuing to work in the cultural field, and my goal is for the Nepali people to get liberation, for the Nepali people to be happy, actually. J.B. Thure, along with Khudiram Pakrin and Jivan Sharma, remained critical of their own parties and were not afraid to speak out. They saw this as one of the duties of an artist, as did Gokul Joshi. Thus, they did not see themselves as sellouts, even though they remained in political parties. The one person to hang on to the idea of being independent was Ramesh. Even Ryan eventually joined a party again. In recent years, these artists and others from subsequent generations have increasingly cooperated across party divides. Granted, there are more parties now, and old friendships often override current affiliations. When newer artists and old from UML and Maoist backgrounds came together at that concert in 2019, not everything was perfect. Let's see if I have this. Yes, I do. But from my position in the back of the hall, seated between UML artist Madhu Gurung and her cousin and People's Socialist Party Nepal artist Kusum Gurung, I could see tears running down the faces of Bidroy and his comrades as they somehow kept singing J.B. Thure's words without allowing their voices to break. Someone, I forget now if it was Ryan or another MC, referred again to Gokul Joshi, along with others, as important initiators of the progressive song movement. It might be that moment that got me thinking about Gokul Joshi as a sort of communist secular jogi, a signifier for the Siddhi-like emotional and political power of song, especially when backed by sincerely felt core convictions. Those artists who see themselves as following in his footsteps believe. They believe the progressive song as an effective and powerful way to make a difference, and that belief itself gives it power. So the work is not done. This everyone also believes. To conclude, I want to play the one Gokul Joshi song that I have easily available to me right now in recorded form. It is sung by Ramesh, and the musical compositions is Ramesh as well. We don't know the melody that Gokul Joshi may have used. The poetic meter, though, is sawai, a meter associated with storytelling that in Gokul Joshi's time was looked upon as only slightly less vulgar and unliterary than jaure, and remains associated with rurality and the common people. Ramesh's musical setting takes the song into the more urbane world of Sugam Sangeet, a conscious juxtaposition common to progressive songwriters who aim to join the modern and the traditional, the rural and the urban for a new musical way forward. Here are the lyrics. I'll just read the translation. You can read the Nepali transliteration as well, and then it's going to play in Nepali. And I'm just going to play this first verse. Who is stopping the stream of visionary thoughts? Who will take charge of carrying the new Nepal? Busy all our lives, our hands remain empty. There is no place in nature to take shelter. The sun has not risen on the ridgetop of Nepal. The rooster has still not crowed in our hills. For a second, let's pay a little bit of attention to the YouTube comments. Yagya Mahesh Gautam has written many comments, including one that says, we have to do like Gokul Joshi. Inu Sharma refers to the lyrics when she writes, really, who will take charge of carrying the new Nepal? The leaders of today who led a movement as if they were going to bring a revolution, but got stuck in the same old mold. How long will Nepalis have to be their slaves? That's a later lyric. The radio personality Tika Bondari, once of the UML and now of the Nepali Congress, and currently doing his PhD on progressive songs in the TU Department of Political Science, writes, the social issues this dynamic song raises are still left in the shadows. Bright days are still yet to come. May the journey continue. May the songs keep resounding. Thank you, Ramesh Dai and Sarthak Academy. And Amir Chand Katiwara writes, exhilarating, revitalizing, and overwhelmingly motivating. By all accounts, that is what Gokul Joshi was going for. Thank you very much. And I hope we still have a little bit of time for questions.
Thanks, Anna. This was wonderful talk. So yeah, I think if you want to, if people want to ask questions, they can ask Anna directly, or if you want to post your comment or question in the chat box. Maybe I can begin.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's there's so many. I mean, it's very intriguing. I mean, it's not. I don't know that much about Nepal, but I have been, I've been working on a book that's coming out, which looks at cinema from Lahore, which from the 50s and 60s, and so those are the there were many poets who were associated with poets and singers who were associated with the cinema, and many of these were also come out of the IPTA, in Indian People Theatres Association kind of legacy. So I guess my question is, of course, you trace Gokul Joshi's journeys through India, but in terms of I was curious to know what is the relationship of this progressive and Maoist poetry, basically folk poetry in Nepal and kind of the larger South Asian context.
In what decade would you like me to concentrate my answer?
Well, I guess he died in what, 1960, but then
1961 is when he died.
Yeah.
I wouldn't consider him a Maoist at all. Exposure to things that were directly Maoist in Nepal come much later. Gokul Joshi didn't identify as any real kind of political ideology. He just identified as a champion of the proletariat, for all I can find out. And he kept getting annoyed with institutions. So he would either make himself too much of a nuisance to them and get kicked out, or he would himself leave. But in terms of relations with IPTA, we see this, I think Gokul Joshi may not have been all that associated with IPTA because he was pretty proletarian, and IPTA was not always that, especially in the Central Squad. But there, in terms of the things that I mentioned in the beginning with the Koirala family and their connections, like these were middle-class people who took up a proletarian cause, and they were Nepalis from the border area of Bihar. So they're from Biratnagar, which is right on the border. And they were educated in India. So they spent time in Kolkata and in cities in various places of India. They likely went to Shillong and other places over there too. And when I listen to songs that have lasted from what they wrote, they have melodic and also structural similarities with some IPTA songs. But I need to do more research on that. I don't know if I'm going to be able to find that out because the people who know about those connections have passed away. So we'll see what might come of that search for connections. I hope that helps answer your question.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's just
in literature, there are definite connections. In terms of music and songwriting, the actual empirical, this person met these people and hung out with them and learned from them is a missing link so far. I can only, there's one song that you probably know, which is E Janga Jashne Azadi, which the melody of that song has been borrowed by a Nepali Congress song sung by Ranudevi Adhikari in 1950.
Oh, I see.
So that's a connection. And these people are not communists, by the way. So that's another interesting connection, because IPTA too is connected with the international, with the Communist International, but also has many other members of different persuasions. And so you mentioned the film industry, like, yeah, total Ipta connection, but in Nepal, it's less so with the film industry. Yeah, this still has to be figured out. Carol, Dipti, I think, had a question first, and then Carol.
Yeah, Dipti, do you want to, should I read the question? Or yeah, just for the recording. Thanks, Dr. Stirr, for the fascinating talk. It was very illuminating. My question, I was curious to understand how Gokul Joshi's work would fit with the later organized Maoist leftist group. I can understand how Ralpha would sort of affiliate with Joshi, but what I understood, please correct me, since Joshi was more like an ascetic, how would that ideology fit with Maoist ideology as they professed it in an organized political spaces?
Okay, the Maoists were extremely ascetic. If you're thinking of ascetic in terms of a lone wandering sadhu, that's not the kind of ascetic they were. The kind of ascetic they were, though, it does have parallels with Hindu ideals of asceticism that are associated with sadhus in terms of like extreme self-discipline toward the cultivation of a better self. So I didn't go into everything about Maoist revolutionary asceticism because I was trying to stay in the earlier part of the 20th century for this talk, but I mentioned a whole lot of authors who have written about that a lot. And there's more, like there's this new book about masculinity, which I haven't yet read, by someone named Heidi, and I'd have to look it up to see exactly its title and the author's name. But this is something that's asceticism, revolutionary asceticism, new man ideology. It was extensively taken up by the Maoists, and the person who I introduced my first anecdote is a Maoist singer who's harking back to Gokul Joshi, saying this is the example of the kind of person we want to be. Somebody who doesn't sell out, who remains dedicated and sacrifices personal luxuries or personal aspirations for the cause for their entire life. So I hope that helps answer your question.
Carol, did you want to?
Hi, Anna. Thanks so much.
Carol, nice to see you. Thank you for coming.
Yeah. So I wonder if you could talk more about the audience, the intended audience for these songs, and how other musicians received these singers and received these songs. I'm thinking of hereditary musicians or even among the tribal groups, right? In other words, did the proletariat adopt these songs and embrace these songs, or was this more of a middle class phenomenon?
In the 1950s and 60s, you have both. In Nepal, the proletariat is not necessarily equated with tribals. It's very different than India, where you have 8% of the population of India being counted as tribal, where in Nepal, the Janjatis, Nepal doesn't use the word tribal, could be, according to some estimates, over 50%, up to 60% of the population. So there are class differences among them as well. They were, though, up until 1950, pretty much excluded from formal education in Nepal. And so because the poetic meters and the song types that Gokul Joshi is choosing are the kinds that are associated with pan-Nepali rural expression of the people who are not of the highfalutin literary classes who have ever been to school. So even if you've been to school a bit in that era, you're already kind of the highfalutin literary classes. So Gokul Joshi, having passed 4th grade in night school while he painted ships and organized strikes in Bombay, like this made him kind of risen up in prestige and status levels so he could merge in those literary circles of Kathmandu, but he never got along with them much. So he did end up, though, in a school, which means that he was in a more, and he was Brahmin himself, so he was in a more high caste milieu at the end of his life. But so Ramesh, who looks up to him, is Newar, as is Ryan, and JB Turi is Kardi, which is basically a Shudra caste. They have fought successfully in recent years to get their name off of the list of Dalits. Then other people who follow along in his footsteps, and especially a lot of the people who joined communist cultural groups from the 1978 referendum on, and Kusiram Pakrin, who I made a movie about, he's Janjati as well. There's a lot of Janjatis who definitely embrace this way of expression, and Dalits as well. Bidroi himself is Dalit. Yeah, the majority of those singers that were in that picture are Janjati and Dalit, and the musicians as well. But in the 50s, it's hard for me to tell. When Ralpha in their 1988 memoir is talking about whose villages they went to, it's a lot of villages of all castes and ethnic groups.
Okay, great, thank you.
There's still like caste tensions and class tensions in all,
All
with
that.
all of them.
Yeah,
And
okay.
like it's easier for me to parse from like 1978 on than it is for before 1978.
Great, I look forward to more results from this.
Thank you.
Well, is this a book project or?
It is a book project. It's gotten out of hand. Because I keep trying to understand things, you know, next I'll be going back to the 18th century. It's definitely gotten, I mean, I have gone back to the 18th century in attempts to, and even like with the Jogi thing to 10th and 12th centuries to try and understand like, what is the difference and what has remained in Nepal of a prior era that kind of got kicked out in India by the rise of Vaishnavism and became like all this tantric emphasis remained in Nepal.
Okay. Oh.
In Buddhism and Hinduism too. So it's like part of a cultural milieu more than what anybody necessarily believes is what I'm trying to say here with this secular emphasis.
Mm-hmm. Other questions, comments? Okay, then please join me in thanking Anna.
Thank you all for coming and for listening, and thank you to Iftikhar and Gloria and everybody at the South Asia program for giving me the opportunity to develop this talk and move this book project forward.
Thank you.
Before all of history.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.